Today, we become legends.
Hey, my name's Inter, and welcome back to the channel for the Smite 2 Closed Alpha 7 update notes. We got a bunch of balance changes coming in this patch, alongside, of course, Thor, Poseidon, and Cupid as the three newest ported gods, along with a couple of other, minor changes to the game as well. So without further ado, let's just jump right in. So first up, we have some general changes. They have added support for DLSS, FSR, and XESS upscaling, which requires an anti-aliasing method to be set to TAA. And this is really good. This will definitely help people with lower NPCs. I'm not actually knowledgeable enough to know if this stuff's on console or not, but definitely for lower NPCs that do support DLSS and FSR. Basically, these are upscaling technologies where, like, for example, if you're playing the game at 1080p, it might render the game at 720p and then it will upscale it to 1080p, so it reduces load on your system. It will look a little bit worse than running at native 1080p, but your frame rates will be substantially better and you'll get a similar-ish image quality. It might be a bit worse, but your frame rates will be a lot better. And so for lower NPCs that were struggling to run Smite 2 beforehand, having DLSS and FSR in the game is going to be really helpful. They have added the Berserker controller layout in control settings. I'm not really sure what this is. I don't play on controller, but I have seen a lot of people asking for Savage. I don't know if that is what this is going to be or if Savage is a different thing. Improvements to the in-game combat log to display information more clearly, which is nice. Improved the off-screen damage numbers in-game to function similarly to Smite 1. That's good. Added god names to the exclusive cosmetic item descriptions for their titles, card effects, and global emotes to differentiate them better in the player loadout. This is good as well. So basically, when you went in and you would see like a frame that was named, you know, whatever, it wouldn't tell you like what the actual god is that unlocks that frame, so it'll be much handier now. You can go into the frames, you can pick one you like, and you can see, oh, that's Cupid's frame, or oh, that's Poseidon's frame. And finally, the god screen environment update, which I think looks really sick. So instead of just like a kind of blank dark background, we've now got this new god screen, and this is the kind of stuff that really makes the game look more polished and like you're not actually in an alpha. Obviously we are still in an alpha, but a lot of these like god screens, like home screens, stuff like that, really did look like, you know, it wasn't really a game, it was more so a test of a game. Whereas as this stuff starts to come in, as we approach free to play, it's going to make the game look a lot more complete and like it is an actual full-fledged game, which is really good. They also did mention they were open to doing the idea of pantheon-themed backgrounds for gods that would be like, you know, similar to this, but themed around each pantheon. So you might have like a wintry one for Norse, or like a tentacle, like dark one for old gods and stuff like that. So that's really sick. I love that. New match settings pop up to choose manual versus auto build or auto skill while in the draft lobby. So this is going to pop up in the draft lobby now to decide if you want to do auto build, auto skill, or like auto filter gods by preferred role. A few conquest changes. So they have updated the fire giant buff material that applies to gods to be brighter and more intense. So this is where it like sort of lights you on fire or like makes you smolder. Basically, that will be a lot more visible, brighter now. They have adjusted bot behavior and game mode balance to help facilitate faster co-op matches for Conquest versus AI. So they have increased the gold spooling, gold XP gain, and decreased Tower Phoenix protections to make bot games a little bit faster. Sort of related, but not really related to this. They did also discuss on the Titan Talk at one point that Kilgun was trying to push for a turbo conquest in Smite 2, which I think will be really cool. I think turbo conquest will be a great way to kind of, you know, maybe you don't have time or effort for a full, complete try-hard conquest game. You could just play Turbo Conquest. And also, like, if you're trying to get into the mode, Turbo Conquest will be a bit easier. You're not going to have to focus as much on, like, farming and micro game. And you can get a little bit faster to those, like, big-scale team fights that a lot of the casual play base enjoy a lot more, you know, from, like, Slash and Joust and Arena and stuff like that. So I do think Turbo Conquest will be really cool, but that's a little bit of a side tangent. This is just for Conquest versus AI. Nothing's changing in regular Conquest in this regard. Moving on, though, for the new gods coming this update. So first up, we have Thor, who is basically identical. The only thing that they've changed is they've moved his ultimate's lightning to his passive, and his 3 will now activate that as well. So you can see on his ultimate, you gain Thunderstruck for 6 seconds of landing. On your 3, you gain 3 seconds of that. So yeah, basically his 3 now applies his ultimate's lightning for 3 seconds instead of 6. He's full strength scaling. There's pretty much nothing different about Thor, which I think is fine personally. It's not an issue. I think Thor is already an amazing design and they didn't really need to do too much for him. They've just added this little extra feature where your 3 gives you a bit of an AoE lightning, which can be really handy for like early jungle clear and just extra damage in team fights in general. Moving on to Poseidon, who didn't get too many changes either. So the main one is that while Trident is active, your 1 now fires 3 waves at once. All 3 of these waves can hit in melee range, and it can absolutely chunk. Subsequent wave hits only do half damage, so if you hit with all 3 waves, you're only doing double the regular ability damage, not triple. But in melee range, you will connect all 3 of these waves, so if you're right up in someone's face trying to hit the triple Trident basic attacks, you will hit the triple wave on them as well. And one other thing they also did with Poseidon's 2 is it's now a basic attack cancel. So you can do an auto attack, press your 2, auto attack again very quickly, whereas before it wouldn't reset your attack chain, so you couldn't do that. Other than that, though, Poseidon is basically unchanged. He's going to be entirely intelligent scaling. He's going to work very similar to the way he did in Smite 1, just with a little extra +1 on the 2. Moving on to Cupid though. So Cupid got some more substantial changes for this patch. So there's been a big remodel of Cupid. He looks a lot different. You've probably seen it by now. There's been a lot of showcasing of it and stuff, especially if you're paying attention to my videos. I've already covered that. The remodel looks great in my opinion, but he's also got quite a few kit changes. So Cupid can now gain up to a maximum of 16 stacks on his passive, and you still use 8 to use the enhanced abilities. So essentially you can store up to 2 enhanced abilities with Cupid's passive now instead of 1. Heart Bomb is basically the same. Also, I believe Cupid has some pretty substantial intelligence scaling. It's not showing numbers here, but he does have some pretty substantial intelligence scaling on Heart Bomb and his ultimate. So do keep that in mind. His 2 has changed dramatically though. So Cupid now lobs an explosive bomb at a target location that detonates after 0.75 seconds, dealing damage to all targets in the area, then spawns the hearts that it regularly would. And if Cupid is at 8 stacks of Love Struck, the hearts also provide a temporary strength and intelligence buff as well when you pick them up. So yeah, Cupid's 2 now is basically a damage dealing ability that also spawns the hearts. So you can just like still throw it on the ground next to your allies and heal them, but you could also throw this at enemies, you know, maybe heal your front line as they're diving in, following up on your like 2's damage and stuff like that. And this also has some intelligence scaling on it as well, I believe. So this helps with your wave clear, it helps with your damage in late game team fights and stuff, but you're still going to get those hearts the same way you always would have from Cupid's 2. His 3, the new feature on that is that the trail now provides movement speed and attack speed to all allies standing in it, so you can get a little bit of like, you know, bonus objective shred or phoenix shred or whatever by just using your dash to give everyone a little bit of attack speed and movement speed. It's not a massive amount, but it does help out a little bit. And finally, for Cupid's ultimate, allies inside the area during the explosion are now going to be healed, so this is going to make it even more teamfight monster of an ultimate. You know, this was already a giant AoE large damage cripple and mez. It's now also going to heal allies inside, and if Cupid is at 8 stacks of Love Struck, the explosion stuns instead of mesmerizing. So in Smite 1, the mez duration would just go up, and that was a little bit pointless because a super long duration mez is often not really needed. You know, you only need a short mez so that you can set up some follow-up on them. Mezzing them for 5 seconds, they're just going to get hit out of it anyway. But now at 8 stacks of Love Struck, which keep in mind, you now have up to 16, so you can potentially do like an enhanced Heart Bomb into enhanced Field of Loves without having to like stack up any more of your passive, which is pretty nuts. So yeah, Cupid got some pretty substantial changes. Poseidon and Thor are basically unchanged with tiny little +1s, but Cupid got some pretty big stuff this patch. Moving into God balance though. First up, the Morrigan, she now has some increased base health. Deadly aspects, they have increased the damage by 10 at all ranks and 5% in scaling. And her 3, they have decreased the cooldown instead of 17 down to 15 depending on rank. It's now going to be 15 seconds flat, so a little bit better for her early game. Of course, you level this ability last, so actually for a pretty substantial portion of the game, you're going to have a little bit of a reduced cooldown on this, make her a bit safer. And more engages as well, of course. Anubis, they have decreased the damage scaling per tick on death gaze by 2% int, and they have increased the cooldown to 90 seconds at all ranks instead of 90 down to 70, which I think makes sense. Anubis is doing really well. This ultimate does absolutely delete with a lot of the changes that they made to lifesteal, with like Soul Gem being super strong now, Typhon's being pretty good. Anubis just really gets a lot of value out of this ultimate, and I think it being on 90 seconds is perfectly fine. This is a pretty reasonable nerf for Anubis. He has been doing really well. Neath is getting some buffs, so they have increased the damage scaling on Spirit Arrow from 90 strength 60 int to 90 strength 70 int, so just added 10% int scaling to that. And Unravel, they have increased the damage scaling from 75 int to 50 strength and 80 int. So a little bit of an increase on the int scaling, but straight up adding 50% strength scaling to Unravel, which, yes, it will be nice for auto-attack Neath if you want to build a standard, like, auto-attack strength build on Neath. But also, in general, Neath builds, you are going to get a little bit of strength from your Transcendence as well. You're going to be getting, like, probably over 100 strength from your Transcendence if you're going for the double stacking build. So that just straight up adds, you know, around 50 damage to this ability, even in that, like, standard ability-based build. Hecate getting some buffs, which is interesting. Hecate is obviously really strong, but she's got a little bit of, like, your Moja syndrome, where I assume the reason she's getting buffs is that she's not performing well in most ranks. We've seen her do incredibly well in high-end ranked and pro play. Even in this most recent Founder Series playoff, she was very dominant. She had an insanely high win rate in like the actual good games with the best teams. But she is very difficult to play, and so she's getting some buffs despite that. So they have increased the damage scaling by 5% on her 2, and they have increased the movement speed on her 3 by, it's going up to 15% at all ranks instead of 5 up to 15. So going to help out her early game a little bit there. Thanatos is getting some buffs. They have increased the damage scaling on Death Scythe by 10% strength, and Soul Reap again by 10% strength as well. So just a little bit of extra strength scaling for Thanatos. I do think this guy's a little bit underrated at the moment. I did put up a game on the second channel very recently where I completely dominated with this god. He does snowball all pretty hard. But I do think, especially for the death scythe, I think being 60% strength is just a little weak. 70% makes sense. Nemesis is getting some buffs. Slice and Dice, they have increased the damage from 55 to 175. It's now 60 to 180, so just 5 base damage at all ranks. And the center damage, of course, gains 10 because it's double. And Retribution Shield now scales down from 14 to 12 seconds, depending on rank, instead of 14 seconds flat. So that's a pretty nice buff as well. Kukulkan getting some buffs definitely makes sense. This guy has absolutely fallen off. He's definitely one of the worst gods in the game at the moment, I would say. He did not perform very well in the Founder Series playoffs either. So Slipstream, they have increased the dash damage by 10. It's probably not going to matter too much, and they have decreased the cooldown of it as well. It's now going to be 13 down to 11 instead of 15 down to 11. So that's definitely going to make him more safe in the early to mid game. And Whirlwind, they have increased the damage per tick as well by towards the late game. Mostly it's going to be the same at rank 1, but so your wave clear is going to not get any better, which is probably fine. But they have increased it a little bit more in the late game. Danzaburo, they have increased the subsequent hit damage on Fool's Gold from 15% to 25%, and on his 2, they have increased the heal per tick by 5 at all ranks. Danza might honestly need more than this, but we don't want to end up with another like Zeus situation where everyone thinks Danza's really bad and then he becomes ridiculously overpowered. So I think this is probably fine for now for Danza, but I do think he's definitely one of the worst gods in the game. Baron Samedi, they have decreased the missing health heal from 5% to 2.5% on his 2 and increased the cooldown to 14 at all ranks instead of 14 down to 12. Life of the party, they have also increased from 90 to 100. It's insane that this was on a 90-second cooldown. In my opinion, it definitely is one of the ultimates that should be on over a 90-second cooldown. And this is good too. The missing health portion of this ability is really the thing that like completely breaks it, in my opinion. Like, yes, the CDR scaling on the heal is really good, but it's really this. Like, if you get hit with a Baron heal when you're like 10% health, you just heal a ridiculous amount. And lowering the cooldown is good too, because obviously Baron Samedi spams cooldown rate regardless, and you end up with this being on like a 6-second cooldown or something. It's kind of ridiculous. So it's now going to be more like a 7-second cooldown, which might seem like a small change, but over the course of, you know, many team fights, many trades, it's definitely going to make a difference. And Baron definitely needed more of these nerfs. We saw him in the playoffs absolutely dominating. He's still doing really well. Definitely needed more. Rata nerf, so Divine Light, they have shifted the solar ray damage from 60 to 85, 60 to 185, sorry, plus 30% in. It's now going to be 30 to 160 plus 45% in. And they have also decreased the duration from 3 to 5 seconds. It's now 2 to 4. So yeah, the shift in damage is really just to take Ra a little bit out of the solo lane, really. It is a little bit of a cancerous build, I'm not going to lie. So instead of it being 60 base damage at rank 1 of this ability, it's going to be 30 now. So it's been halved at rank 1. The damage late game is going to be, you know, roughly the same if you have a little bit of int in your build. And if anything, it will be a little bit more if you're building like full int mid lane Ra, but it is going to be probably substantially less if you're building full tank Ra from solo lane. But it's really this 60 going down to 30. It's just going to make his level 1 pressure and wave clear that is basically uncontested at the moment into, you know, much more manageable. And of course, decreasing the duration as well will just nerf this across the board. Finally, Ymir is getting an increase to the damage dealt debuff on his passive from 10 to 15%, and Frost Breath now is 14 at all ranks instead of 16 down to 14. I'm not sure if Ymir really needs buffs, to be honest. I think he's in a pretty balanced spot. He has seen a good amount of play in the Founder Series, actually doing really well, especially in EMEA. But there are definitely a lot of supports that are outclassing Ymir at the moment, so I'm kind of fine with him getting a bit of a buff. Moving into item balance though, Deathbringer, they have given it 5 more strength and 5% more crit, which I think is probably fine. Crit has definitely fallen out of the ADC meta, especially since they made the changes a while back that made it 1.65 damage instead of 1.75. Most ADCs are going for more of a kin size build nowadays. Even Jingwei is sometimes foregoing a lot of crit just to go into the kin size. So I think Deathbringer getting a buff is going to help a lot with making crit builds a bit more competitive. Stampede is getting a 150 gold cost reduction, which is the active item that's basically sprint. There's a new tier 1 and tier 2 that are health regen based. Olmec Blue, which I assume is also another like tier 2 or tier 1 item. Tier 2, I assume, based on the fact that it's got a recipe. They've increased the health regen by 2. Amanita Charm by 2 and Hide of the Nemean Lion by 2 as well. They probably build from this item, so a little bit extra health regen there. And again, these might seem like small numbers, but these are 5 times less than what you would be getting in Smite 1. So an increase of 2 health regen is an increase of 10 HP 5 equivalent from Smite 1. So it is a pretty substantial change. Fence's Buckler is a new tier 2. And Berserker Shield, they have adjusted the recipe to include this. They've removed the health, but added 20 physical and 20 magical protection. So this is interesting. I'm not sure if I love this change, because Berserker Shield generally is used as like that. You're playing against a warrior in solo lane, you're rushing into Berserker Shield, and adding 20 magical protection is probably not going to help the item whatsoever in that regard. But I guess it might make it a little bit more attractive for the late game. But yeah, losing the health to gain a small amount of physical protection and some magical protection that won't honestly matter it probably is going to make this item worse as like a rush for like your Bellonas, your Amaterasu's in solo lane. Talisman of Purification, they have decreased the cooldown rate from 20 to 15, which I don't love, honestly. Talisman of Purification is incredibly popular and probably does need a nerf, but cooldown rate is very hard to access in support builds at the moment, which is why I don't love that they've hit the cooldown rate on this. I'd rather they hit one of the other base stats. Just because cooldown rate is very difficult to come by in support builds, and often a lot of your cooldown rate is coming from something like your Talisman in the early game. I have Providence, they have decreased the cost by 100. That's fine, this item isn't really picked up all too much. And Eye of the Storm, they have adjusted the self damage from true damage to magical damage, but then increased it slightly. So you can now mitigate this damage. That is a massive buff. You're taking 0.5% more of your max health. But even with like a tiny amount of magical procs, this thing's going to be reduced by like half pretty much. And, you know, if you're up at like 200, 300 magical procs, you're going to be reducing it by like 2/3 or 75%. It's going to be a massive buff to the item. You're going to be able to use this much more. But that is it for the CA7 patch notes. So some pretty substantial balance here. Hopefully they've taken into account a little bit of what happened in the playoffs for Founder Series. That was a really interesting watch. I'll probably have a video coming out at some point on like what we learned from that, you know, what meta shifts were there, what was performing best, all that kind of stuff. But that is it for the CA7 patch notes. Let me know what you think down below. Are you excited for Thor, Poseidon, and Cupid? I definitely am, and I will catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.